And we're live. Welcome, everybody. This is the Reality Czars podcast, and we're your hosts, Nate and Tony.
Hello.
And we have the awesome returning champion, Sal the Agorist. How's it going, brother?
How are you guys?
Dude, we're doing good. We are doing good. I was telling you a little bit before this that, like, I just put out a Bigfoot documentary. Tony, you never fucking told me you were writing a pamphlet on agorism.
Well, I did asshole. a while back. I did. But
that's awesome, dude.
The impression was sided.
So hold on, wait. Let's back up for 1 second. We just got started. Let's back up.
Yeah,
What's the name of the documentary and the name of the pamphlet? I need to know both. I want to write both of these things down right now.
Okay, it's called The Search for Psychic Sasquatch.
Okay.
Because we think that he is psychic and interdimensional. Not necessarily a flesh and blood creature.
I hope you're wrong. I hope you're wrong.
You know, he's a nice guy, dude. He's a nice guy, and he'll talk to you. Like it's.
So
yeah.
Agorism, the Path of Freedom, and I'm putting it out on Kindle. It'll be a minute before it's actually out there, though, because I'm figuring that out.
Hell yeah, dude! That's fucking awesome.
You're in New Hampshire, right, Tone?
Rhode Island.
Rhode Island. Okay. That's like state of central, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Can it be? It's not as bad as it is here, is it, Tony?
Worse than it's people are more bought into this idea of the state. So I think that, like, you get all the crazy shit out west because they're trying to take people who are already kind of out of the state and drag them in. So you get a lot of
people seem more militant out here, and I think people just take it for granted out there. They're like, "Of course, we love the state."
You know, honestly,
like in here, they're like, "I want to smash your fucking head in with a hammer if you don't."
Yeah,
if you don't worship communism.
Yes, but at the same time, it started where Tony's at. Like all the Puritan, like nonsense, like the progressives, and that started in New England.
Well, Rhode Island's a pirate cave. Like we're like Rhode Island started because we did not like that shit.
Okay.
And we wanted to trade with pirates and do a lot of sketchy shit.
Hey,
so
I'm all down with that.
That sounds like agorism to me, dude. They were the agorism, yeah.
Yeah. I think we had some slavery too, but aside from that, it's
they all had some slavery back then.
Yeah.
It's funny, man. There's some interesting stuff. The East Coast is so much older than the West Coast. And so there's like a lot more, what's the word I'm looking for? There's just a lot more baggage over there with shit. Like I have a buddy that is like a Freemason, and he was telling me he lives down in Florida, and he's telling me about like his lodge, and they're still by like some sort of Southern rules down there. So he's like, yeah, black people aren't allowed in. And I was like, what?
Oh, yeah,
he goes, no, they have their own lodge. He goes, they just, and I'm not allowed in there. I'd have to get permission from like the high up chief, whatever, for me to walk into his lodge. And same. I was like,
some parts of Florida, man, it's like it's still the deep South running. People don't realize that because everybody's moving into Florida, and they're having like a sort of culture shock. Like eventually, like they encounter deep South Florida. Like you might move to Tampa, you might move to Miami or Fort Lauderdale, but eventually you're going to encounter deep South Florida. And there's always a culture shock. Like,
well, that's the thing too about Republicans. Well, go ahead. Sorry, your cousin does what?
No, my cousin lives like an hour and a half north of here, and I went up to see him. I counted like 28 Confederate flags. I'm like,
oh yeah,
this is a different world. This is a different world, you know.
Totally, dude. What I was gonna say is like Republicans like out west that are like moving there, like California Republicans are not the same thing as like an Alabama Republican.
No,
you know what I mean? They're like way softer. You know what I mean? Because they have to be, because they had to live in fucking liberal hellhole, and so they had to like soften their edges. Well, so I almost think it makes a better Republican, because it's like they're you don't get the radical, because they're not in their own little like fucking like echo chamber, and they don't have all the like institutional power. That's why you get the worst Democrats on the West and East Coast, you know, in their little areas, because they live in their echo chamber. They think everyone fucking agrees with them. They can get as extreme as they want, and it's just like taken for granted. But a Democrat like in Alabama has to be kind of on their toes a little bit. So you get the best Democrats, I think, like down there, and you get the best Republicans on the West Coast. But what I was going to say is like those fucking West Coast Republicans that are moving to Florida, like they're fine with gay marriage, they're fine with this, that, and the other. You know, they're probably for legalizing pot and stuff like that. They're almost like a soft, like statist libertarian. You know what I mean? And then you put them down like with some deep South Republicans. They're like, I don't like black people.
Right. Yeah, I know. There, you know, it's funny, man, because there's such a conglomeration of people down here now. It's like it really is a melting pot. Like I remember I posted on Twitter recently there. I was at a bar with like a guy from Scotland, a lady from like, I don't know, she was from like Illinois or something, and like my friend from North Carolina, and like everybody. The only thing we all had in common is that we were all in Florida escaping socialism and communism. Yeah. So it's like people from California, New York, New Jersey, Europe, Asia, all over the world. They're coming to Florida because they want free, they want low taxes.
That's wild,
dude. Guns.
I would love to move to Florida, but I would fucking melt, dude. I don't think I can handle it. We got our first comment. Shout out to Scott Armstrong from Rebunked. He says, "What's up, gang? At the Agorist compound in the East Tennessee. Much love to you all." Nice. All right.
Yeah.
Much love, brother. Much love. Hell yeah, dude. So Scott actually, he was from Oregon as well. He was like in Eugene, and he got the fuck out of there. He's killing it, dude. He's doing great out there. So, yeah.
That's where all those ranchers were.
In Tennessee?
No, Eugene, Oregon, and places like that.
Oh, the Bundy stuff, yeah.
Yeah.
Was that in Eugene?
Yeah.
No shit. Okay. Yeah, dude, that was some serious shit. Like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's funny.
It's one of the most untalked about crimes that the federal government has committed in the last 10 years was when Barack Obama was president. The amount of land that this guy seized by fiat, by executive order, he just declared all of this land federal government property. And a lot of it was in like Nevada and like Oregon and Utah, and like Bears Ears National Monument. The guy turned like tens of millions of acres or some shit like that into like a national monument with a stroke of a pen, which means you can't like build, you can't have a house. So if like nowadays everyone's like, oh, why can't millennials afford a house anymore? It's like, well, because the federal government took all the goddamn all the property.
You can cuss on here, it's fine.
And it's like, I don't know. It drives me nuts.
Yeah, dude, they absolutely own so much land. Because, yeah, I mean, so much, like, people talk about, like, overpopulation and this and that and the other, and I think that's all bullshit. But, like, you know, there's that saying that, like, and I think that it's true. I can't do the math myself because I'm not fucking that smart. But I think theoretically, even if you gave every single person on the planet, like, an acre of land, they'd be able to fit in North America. Yeah. Like, and if you had them shoulder to shoulder, they would like fit in like Texas or something like that. It's something crazy like that.
But all the farmland.
That's the thing. Yeah. And the federal government like owns 98% of Nevada or something like that. Something stupid. Like they've taken everything. They take everything. And then they call you a fucking parasite while they're like having their hand in your back pocket. Yeah. They're absolute bastards. Shit, man. Well, what have you been up to?
I just finished writing a book on.
Oh shit.
Yeah, it was a serious project. It took me about a year. I just finished like in the last month, and I have you guys are the first to know. Brian McClanahan is going to write the foreword for it. I don't know if you guys are familiar with McClanahan, but he's a great historian. He's got the Brian McClanahan show. He's affiliated with the Abbeville Institute, does amazing work. So he's doing the forward now. Once that's done, I'm going to put it out. I'm going to have Lily Forrester is going to do the cover design and everything.
Hell yeah.
In the Agorist family. You know how I like to do it. And yeah, it should be out within the next month or so. But like it spans the entire like spectrum of revisionist history. I remember Sam saying like, and I can never find the quote where he said it, but I remember him saying like, agorism is, he said something like you take a little bit of revisionist history, a little bit of logic, and a little bit of Austrian economics. You mix them up in a pot, and you stir it up, and you have agorism. So I figure, all right, well, the revisionist history stuff is so interesting to me because the government lies about so much of it, and they have to maintain this fiction that they are this like benevolent entity. So it's really important that people learn the truth about history, which is why I set out in the whole project to begin with. And it goes through, the book is going to be called The American Experiment. And it's all about how America was like this experiment in government, about how, like, if we can combine some elements of Greek democracy and some elements of Roman republicanism, and we can add these checks and balances and separation of powers, this whole convoluted system of like trying to restrain government. And despite all that, it still failed. And I walk the reader through the whole failure. But at the conclusion, it's like, despite all this, it failed. It's like at a certain point, you have to just admit that the task itself was flawed. And that's the sort of whole premise of the book. And I'm excited about it. I think it's going to be good.
I mean, and I almost, honestly, dude, I think it was almost designed to fail on purpose. I think it was always about like consolidating power and in so many different ways. Maybe not like when it was first envisioned, like when it was like what do they call that? It was what the hell were they called? It was the something Confederacy. You know what I'm talking? Yeah, it was the Article of Confederacy was a little bit more decentralized, and then it was almost like a coup that happened with the Constitution, and so it was like. Anyways, it seems to me like it was designed to centralize power.
That's exactly what happens. We had the Articles of Confederation, and I cover this all in the book. We had the Articles of Confederation and a cabal of bankers, of elites, financial interests, basically started to take over. And this was started back in the colonial era under Robert Morris, who was a heavy influence on Alexander Hamilton, who agitated for, among other things, a central bank. And that's where we have this legacy of debt slavery, where we're all debt slaves now to the welfare warfare state. I trace all of that back to Hamilton and Morris. You're exactly right. But that cabal of elites didn't stop with Morris. That kept going, right? That kept going through the Civil War, the Progressive Era, World War I, II, and up till today. And
in 1913, man, is when those central banks really got their hooks in, right? And that's like with the Federal Reserve, dude. That was the death knell. That was when it was too late. And like people talk about what was too late, but it seems like that was like the real nail in the coffin. That like we were just walking dead at that point. Like we didn't know it yet. It was like the introduction of like of a disease that was spreading. Yeah. You know what? The turning point the way I see it, and the way I wrote it in the book, the turning point is, I don't want to give it all away, but the turning point is the Civil War. And it was yeah, you're right.
And what he did with the Civil War, if Lincoln never waged war on the states on behalf of the federal government, the horrors of the 20th century never would have been able to happen. People would not have accepted the death tolls of World War I and World War II. Those battles, the death tolls of those battles were outrageous. People don't understand modern society can't cope with those numbers of casualties. The only reason why our grandparents were able to deal with that is because their grandparents dealt with similar numbers under Abraham Lincoln. And it's all a chain of precedent is what it is. But it starts with Hamilton. The turning point really when the people lost control was under Lincoln. And then all of that power was sort of consolidated and centralized in the Progressive Era, which created World War I and II, and then the Cold War and the Middle East conflict, and Bush and Obama, and all the state of digital feudalism that we all live in, unfortunately, today.
Yeah, 100%. Sorry, go ahead, Tony.
Well, I was going to say, Lincoln gets this pass too because people look at slavery as being this rightfully horrible thing. But there's nothing about talking about like there would have been other options, right? Like you could have offered like, okay, we're going to separate, we're going to tariff anything made with slave labor, we're going to offer refugee for any escaped slave,
that's if Abraham Lincoln cared about the slaves, but he didn't. He cared about keeping the Union together. Yeah, so that's why he didn't do that, because his priority was keeping his centralized power and not humanitarian at all.
point.
See,
Fair
yeah.
point.
See. What was going on was they were taking tariff revenue, and they were using all this tariff revenue for public works projects up in the north, like bridges, roads, shit like that, all up in the north. And the Republicans were able to go back to their constituents and say, I built the bridge. I kept all you guys employed. You better vote for me. So like it was, nowadays we call this pork barreling, right? When they, add on to some bill, some stupid infrastructure project that's unnecessary, just to keep their constituents back home happy. That's what they were doing with tariff revenue. So when the South was like, we're getting robbed here, we don't want to pay this tariff revenue anymore. All of a sudden, the Republicans were like, if you guys stop paying the tariff, our electoral monopoly is now in jeopardy. We can't let this happen. So they went to war over it, and they maneuvered the South into firing the first shot, and I cover all that in the book. But the war was going so badly initially. Up until 1862, the South was winning. It actually looked for a time like the idea of a limited Republican government might actually survive, like the Jeffersonian ideal might actually work. And at some point along the line, they realized that under Grant and Sherman specifically, they realized that war against civilians is very effective, right? To wage a war of terror upon a civilian population is a pretty good way of getting people in line. And that's what they did. And once they realized how effective that was, they spread that strategy throughout the entire South. And within 2-3 years, the American people fell and they were conquered by the federal government. But in order to get the soldiers to wage war against their own people, to kill civilians, to wage war against civilians, to burn down houses and churches and hospitals and stuff like that, to get people to commit such depravities, the only way to do that was to turn it into a moral crusade. That's when it became about slavery. That's when it became this whole like moral thing, which of course was a joke because, and I walk through this in the book, but like that had the whole impact of creating this feeling of animosity between Southern whites and Southern blacks that turned into Jim Crow and lynchings. And so all of that history of white supremacy dates back to, ironically, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which, as he said, was an act of war. And he was absolutely right. It had nothing to do with freeing the slaves. He could care less about them. He had said multiple times that he was an avowed white supremacist. He didn't hide that at all from anybody ever. And once in his career, I mean, in 1850, you couldn't get elected by saying that you believed in racial equality. Nobody would vote for you then. That's the other thing. It's like people forget that like the North was just as racist in 1850.
Absolutely. Yeah.
New Jersey had slaves until they were the last ones, so like 1867 or 66 or something like that. So, it's people don't know history, and I'm hoping that with the book I can sort of move people along the line to like a real history education.
Well, also one of the things that is really, there's a lot of textile mills up here that are still here. You'll see the brick buildings. What were they making their textiles out of? Oh, that cotton that they were growing in the South of slave labor, right? Like this was all one thing. So you can't be against slavery, but then also be like, yeah, I want some cotton for my factories up here.
Right. It's very I don't know. It's the history. People have no concept of history, but that's done intentionally, right? That's like we have no idea what it was like for the average person today. Can't imagine what life was like for somebody in the Civil War era or in World War I or World War II, like to be a civilian or a young male adult in 1917 or in 1861 or 1942. People have no concept of what that was like. And if we're able to impart to them what that was like, maybe we can prevent the wars in the future that the political class will necessarily bring about.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. I mean, that's one of those scary things is like people are really trying to push that we are going to have a war with Russia soon. And they're
trying.
And why, though? I don't get it. Like, that's a war that nobody, like, we don't want that. Like the people don't want that.
You know what? You know what though, Nate? It's funny you say that. I tell you, man, I want to send both of you guys a copy of this book because I learned as much as I imparted in the course of writing this book. One of those things that I learned is that there hasn't been a war that the American people have supported since the Revolution.
Yeah.
The American people have not been behind any one of these wars.
And America hasn't had a defensive war since like the Revolution. And even then, I mean, that wasn't, but it kind of.
other than what the Southern people went through in 1860.
Exactly.
No. But like, you know, it's I don't know. And, you know, Bob Higgs always talks about how war and the growth of government go together and how they expand. There's like this correlation between the war and crisis and Leviathan, as he calls it.
Yeah.
And it's incredible how it matches up.
And I mean, that was just like the second government realized that if this is a time of crisis, then I get these special powers. That was it. Like we were going to get, what do you need there? The car keys? I hung it up.
But our crisis is over now.
Yeah, but no. So like the second
the government ends,
the crisis will never end because they don't want to give up those powers, and they absolutely never will. And that's just
I'm giving away the whole book now, but like Bob Higgs calls it like the ratchet effect. So it's like the people like after the crisis like subsides a little bit, the people get some liberties back. What's up, little man?
And say hi. He's turning 1 next week.
I got him. Oh
Awesome.
Man, 1.
I know it's wild, dude.
You're a number. Got 1.
Crazy.
I'm sorry. So what did Higgs say?
No, yeah. So so the ratchet effect. So like there's this crisis, and then because of the crisis, the government assumes these emergency powers, and once the crisis subsides, the people never get they get some of their liberties back, but they never get all of them back. And Higgs calls that the ratchet effect, and like I trace that from like Lincoln all the way back to like now with like the Patriot Act and how like ridiculous it's actually gotten. But yeah, I mean. You know, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, and that was during the Civil War. Obama wrote the National Defense Authorization Act, which repealed habeas corpus, and it never went back into effect. People don't talk about that, though, because nobody knows about it. They're not going to teach you that in the public school nowadays.
Yeah, no, not at all. They're not even going to teach you what habeas corpus is because they don't want you to think that you have those rights.
No.
Because for 1 second, maybe that means when your teacher says, do you have a plant in your pocket, turn your pockets out. And I was like, I'm not doing that. I learned in history class about habeas corpus, and you're not going to search and seize me right now. They don't want you to know anything. They don't want you to have like
those rights anymore. They're gone.
They don't. They're
gone. If you claim,
it's a joke.
The cop laughs at you because they're trained to know that you don't have those rights anymore. They're gone. So that's like people talk about the Constitution and like.
Well, that's the goofy thing is like you swore an oath to what? Like, and now you're doing what?
I've got dear friends of mine are conservatives, close friends of mine. And it's like, they're like, this is the most important election ever. And the Constitution is at threat. And I'm just like, dude.
Oh, you mean for your man that was like pushing red flag laws? Yeah, we definitely need that guy. Like,
what part of the Constitution remains intact? Give me one aspect, one clause.
They think that Donald Trump is going to save him, and I was like, he's literally the guy that said, "Well, let's seize guns first, and then we'll do what's the word that he said? Anyways, we'll do it's bullshit.
Seize the guns first, due process second.
Due process second, yeah." And you're like,
right.
The due process is what? Anyways, you stupid asshole.
The part of in other words, the 5th and the 14th Amendments. Forget about that.
Well, and even if you completely go by the Constitution, you can amend the Constitution any way you want to. So it's not like this perfect. Like I think people put too much faith in the Constitution to begin with. Like that's not the source of your rights. Like if you want to use it as a template, fine, but it also might have been a power grab.
Dude, that's the biggest thing. Tony, you just hit the nail on the. Yeah, you just. God damn it, I can't even talk right now. But yeah, the source of your rights is not a piece of paper, and if the source of your rights are a piece of paper, then everything is up for argument. Then nothing means nothing, because like if your rights are held on a piece of paper, they can just change that piece of paper, and then your rights are gone. So what are we doing here?
The Republicans need to maintain that fiction, because if your rights, if it's true that your rights come from God, like you and I know that it is in fact the case, then, well, guess what? What are you going to do? You're going to give rights to immigrants? You're going to give rights to Iraqis and Arabs and Syrians and
gay people and trans people and
people coming from Venezuela and Cuba and Mexico? Like they're humans too, with the same rights as you and I. No way. They can't. Not only that, but like go back to like 50 years ago. Like the British and the French could never admit that people in Africa had the same rights, because that's where all their colonies were. Yeah, they had these vast colonial dominions of brown people. They could never admit that those people had the same rights as them. So the state would. It's almost like they only say they only admit what's true is whatever's convenient for them. Unfortunately, whereas you and I know that that's not the case.
Well, yeah, man. I mean, try to talk to like even a Republican like that's like in their 40s right now. Try to tell them that like. Because I mean, this is what they think for everybody else, but it's like, so maybe we can't hold some Arab dude indefinitely without a trial, and we can just torture him whenever we want to. Like, if the
dude,
if civil rights didn't do anything.
How about Anwar al-Awlaki, another case I cover in the book? This guy is an American citizen from Las Cruces, New Mexico, who is suspected of merely inspiring terrorist activity. Rather than be brought back to the United States, where he faces a jury of his peers decide his fate at the conclusion of a fair trial, as is required by the 5th and 14th Amendments, Barack Obama just has the guy droned to death. Right? So, like, no due process, no trial, no jury, no nothing, just executed. American citizen, by the way. And then he went out to kill the guy's 16-year-old son from Colorado. Then 3 years later, however long it was, Donald Trump murdered his 7-year-old little girl.
Yeah.
Who's crying to death in her mother's arms as she's shot to death. And it's like, not for nothing, but like these taxpayers have blood on their hands. It's like, what are you guys paying for after? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, here? I can blame it on taxpayers, but we're kind of forced at the fucking point of a gun. But you know who you can really fucking blame? Assholes that go out and fill out a ballot and vote. You're voting for these pieces of shit.
Blame to go around. You know what I mean? It's like, don't enlist, don't vote. Stop paying your tax. And I can't tell you stop paying your tax. It's illegal, but like,
don't pay any tax that you can avoid legally. Wink, 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 wink.
That's why I tell people to become your own bank and to use Bitcoin Cash and use cryptocurrency rather than using Federal Reserve notes as your medium of exchange. You can stop paying the inflation tax. You can stop paying sales tax. You can stop paying and the biggest one is inflation, by the way.
Dude, and progressives will start yelling at you. They'll start saying, you don't want to pay your taxes because you're selfish. And I'm like, I don't want to pay my taxes because I don't want little girls to die in fucking drone strikes. Like, the fuck
if that's selfish, then yes, you call me. I'm the most selfish guy in the world. I want no children to die by drone strike.
I mean, it is selfish in some way. Like I'm gonna be happier knowing that this shit's not happening. So yeah.
It's insane. But you know what? At the end of the day, the problem is that the wars can't end because then the elites lose control. Like, there is, in fact, a secret cabal of elites, of elite financial interests who have been pulling the strings since at least the turn of this century, and then around 1900. They can, once the second or third generation of those Kabbalists had died off, like in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and one of them lived to be like 1,000 years old, David Rockefeller Jr. But like, once those guys had died out, they transferred that power. What they did was they didn't just go away. They didn't just hand over power. It's just like they didn't just disappear. They created institutions like Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Chamber of Commerce, all these different institutions they've created, and they radiate throughout society into what Murray Rothbard called a permanent government. And he is absolutely right, because when you go into like even the more modern historical instances, when you take a deep dive into like the first Gulf War, it's all about Rockefeller oil. When you, and they all without fail come down to elite financial interests. That's why American kids go off to fight and die in all these wars around the globe, and it's a shame. It really is.
Yeah, man, it's wild. Have you looked into the Fabian Society at all?
No, what's that?
So the Fabians, I'm sure you've heard of this. So the Fabian Society was this society of people. They were called the Fabian Socialists, right? And so this started, I think it was 1884. In 1884, it was created, and it was these group of folks that loved Karl Marx. They thought Karl Marx was fucking awesome. They just disagreed with their methods. So they thought, like, all these guys that are being revolutionaries and trying to, like, take it overnight, they're crazy and stupid, and they're going to get, like, a lot of, like, people are going to fight back and freak out. So their whole method was, like, and their mascot, they have two mascots, dude, and they're fucking wild. So the first one is this tortoise, and you can still look at it, and it says, like, oh man, so for the time we strike, we wait, but when we strike hard. So that's like their whole methodology is this slow and steady and just eating away people's civil rights, this, that, and the other, and trying to like consolidate power. And like they're the ones that made the World Economic Forum. They're the ones that made the Council on Foreign Relations. Like the Rockefellers were Fabian socialists. Like it was this group of people that you can like tie together. It's fucking wild, dude. And the other one, and you can find this like on the Fabian Society, they had this, it's really pretty, this like stained glass. It's a wolf in sheep's clothing. It's just like you can't even fucking make this shit up. It's like,
I know. It's like if they tried to make it more obvious, they couldn't. The part that I thought about that was craziest, that I learned that I didn't know in my research that I came across, was all of this. A major impetus for this was in like the late 19th century, like 1880s and stuff like that. There was a dude in England. It might be Cecil Rhodes. I could be getting the name wrong or something like that.
Cecil Rhodes is a motherfucker, dude.
It's probably the same guy.
Yeah.
There was some elite British guy, and this sounds crazy. Okay, I'm going to sound like a lunatic for a second. Let me put my tinfoil hat on. His plan.
You're in good company here. That's fine.
Okay, good. His plan was to bring America.
Back into the British Empire. Yes, that was Cecil Rhodes.
You know about
100%. Yeah, and on his deathbed, he left his entire fortune for that. He said, "We are going to create a secret society. There's all my money is in the creation for a secret society to bring the United States back into the British Empire." 100%.
So what I learned in my research writing The American Experiment was that he had created two wings of this monster, this entity with this goal of bringing the U.S. back into the English Empire. Two arms of this were the elites in the U.K. Who were headed under and organized under the Rothschilds, and then in the U.S. where they were headed underneath like the Rockefellers and the Morgans. So you had this in England you had the Rothschilds, and in America you had the Rockefellers and the Morgans, and they worked together. And you can follow what they did all throughout World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the Middle Eastern, all the bullshit going on now. It's insane how much power they have, but everybody pretends like it doesn't go on. It's not real. You're a
conspiracy theorist. You're anti-Semitic for bringing up the Rothschilds. Well, you said the Rothschilds, so you must hate Jewish people. You're like, it's crazy. Well,
here's the thing, though. It's like, and I say this in the book. It's like, everybody knows, everybody understands, everybody admits that money influences the decisions of politicians and elected officials. But the moment that you begin to name names and name institutions like the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, once you begin to do that, then you're a conspiracy theorist. Then you have your Alex Jones level, and you have your tinfoil hat on.
Even if you literally have everything to back it up, if you can be like, you can go here, and they're like, nope, you're crazy. Yeah,
It's
that's why
crazy,
we
but
get called conspiracy theorists. That's why I don't like you're calling it revisionist history. It was like we're just telling history. Like the American government is the one that tells the fucking made up bullshit. Like
no, right, but
they're
but
reshaping history. Like they're
true, but the
yeah.
term revisionist history comes from Ralph Rako, who is a great Austro-libertarian historian, and he said that he defined, and he's got this great book which I recommend to everyone. It's one of the books that influenced me the most in my whole life, called "Great Wars and Great Leaders: A Libertarian Rebuttal." And I was like this history buff, this nerdy history, U.S. Constitution. And I read Ralph Rako talking about how it's all a lie. And I'm just like blown away. But one of the things he says in this book is he defines historical revisionism as the unmasking of excuses used for war making.
Damn.
So I like to think that the book that I wrote will hopefully contribute a little bit to that.
I like that quote. I'm going to use that later. I'm going to turn that into a fucking meme.
Yeah, for real. Oh, by the way, your memes are lit, man.
Oh, thanks, man.
So good.
Hell yeah.
I feel like revisionist history gets this bad rap, but then it's like, isn't history by definition revisionist? Like, if you're not re-envisioning it, then you're...
history is written by the state.
Right? His story, dude. It's all fucking... Yeah.
But like the state has to maintain this enormous lie about what a great people they are, what a great job they've done. They're here on this big mission, to make limited government and a government of the people, by the people, and for the
people.
Not
anymore, though, which is the wild thing. Is like that used to be considered a good thing, limited government, but now they're like patting themselves on the back by, look how big we're making government.
I know.
Look how much money I spent.
Dude, it goes to show
look how much control we have.
Yeah,
it's sad, and like that's one of the things I do in the books. I try to like compare, like even like the ancient Greek like aristocrats, like how they can compare to like modern day progressives. It's insane. Like, do you think Joe Biden was the first one to cancel a debt? No, they've been doing the same shit for thousands of years, and people fall for it without fail every single time. It's like, read a book. Like, think to yourself. Like, I just want to take a book and smack them over the head with it. It's like, come on.
But
people.
like in those other ways, it wasn't the government like stealing your money and then like paying these other it's just so fucking different now, because like there was like giant debt forgiveness back in the day, like in the old like Jerusalem, they called it Jubilee. They would do it every 7 years, but that was like I almost
that was different though. That was voluntary.
It was absolutely voluntary.
Were voluntary. This is like
I'm putting a gun against your head, and you're gonna pay for this like trans like underwater basket weaving crazy like this person owes $100,000 to this weird fucking, and you're gonna pay for her college, or I'm gonna put you in jail.
There's nothing spiritual or voluntary about it. Joe Biden is forcing me to pay for this shit. I don't want to pay for it. I'm forced to pay for it.
Well, it's just in the banker bailout too. It's the same exact thing with the loans for houses 10 years ago, where it's just like, we put a bunch of bad loans out there. But it's the same thing where it's like, we just gave a bunch of bad loans, and now we're not getting our money back. So please bail us out.
That was like the last part
after those banks seized all those houses first. They took all the houses back, and then they were like, okay, now we're going to need the money back. Like, we get the money and the house. Government bail us out.
so corrupt. The last part of the book was the bailouts. So that's like what's really fresh in my mind. And it still makes me angry when I think about 700, was it billion or $1 trillion? It doesn't make a difference at this point that Bush wrote for TARP that was only supposed to be for these industries or whatever. He signed the bill in October of 2010. Troubled Assets Relief Program, TARP, $700 billion, let's call it, for the mortgage industry or whatever. Well, he signed the bill in October. By December, within 2 months, he issued an executive order, an edict, essentially, saying that all that money, this is going back in 2010 when 700 billion was a lot of money. All that money can be used however the federal government sees fit. So, well, guess what? All of the cabal bankers, all of the elites, all of the same elites that we're talking about, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Rothschilds, they showed up like pigs at the trough, like for a taste of that money, of that 700 billion. And now what they've done is they've created a moral hazard where no company has any incentive to save funds for a rainy day or for an emergency fund. So what happened was you had throughout the 2010s, all of these airlines, instead of saving money where like a normal firm should or would, if you were a multi-billion-dollar company, you wouldn't have like you wouldn't be operating at a baseline level. You would have some money in the bank, obviously. All these airlines didn't, because they knew that if they ever hit a hard time, the federal government would bail them out. So they would spend all that money. All those 10 years were spent all that money was spent on stock buybacks to drive down the number of shares and drive up the stock price to line their own pockets of the CEOs and the rich, the elites. And what happened in 2020? They got a bailout for like $50 billion. It's insane what's going on right now. The American people put up with it. I don't get it.
And well, it's a system too, because if you're some CEO at an airline, you're just making a decision between, is it cheaper to pay off a congressman or to save money for when shit goes down? And it's like, well, it's cheaper just
of
to pay off
course.
the
And Tone,
Yeah.
that's the inherent lesson of the American system, of the American experiment, is that it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Like, eventually you got to accept the fact it just doesn't work. Like, there's going to be incentives as long as there's a government to appropriate the what's the word I'm looking for? To like appropriate their monopoly on violence.
Yeah.
There's going to be some firm out there willing to pay to exploit it.
I completely agree.
100%, dude.
Completely agree.
100%.
It's unfortunate, but and I asked Brian McClanahan, who's not an anarchist. He's like a brilliant historian. He's a federalist. He's like a minarchist, federalist, constitutionalist, libertarian. I asked him to write the foreword, and I'm like anxious to see what he says, because like my conclusion is that the government doesn't work. Like, my conclusion is that this is all proof that it fails. So I'm interested to see what he says. I told him, I said, hey, if you disagree, feel free to say that. As an agorist, I welcome the disagreement. So, have at it.
I think you can make the case that you can get it to work with a lot of hard work for a short period of time. Now, there's like
a couple decades, a decade. I mean, by the time that they wrote the Articles of Confederation to the time that Robert Morris and Alexander Hamilton corrupted it was less than 15 years.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's nuts.
Everybody says Robert Morris. They call him the financier of the revolution. But Murray Rothbard said that, in fact, the revolution financed him, right? Because, he was telling everybody, oh, I got money. We're going to fight the British. I got money, this and that. But guess who was making all the money off these dead soldiers, these dead militiamen? And, shit doesn't change. It's the same thing with like today and like Vietnam and like Iraq. It's like, who's making money off these dead kids? It's not you and me. You know what I mean? It's not us. And, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. The circle of elites closes and gets smaller and smaller.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing, dude. Yeah, and there's these small groups of families that they only marry each other. They have these they intermarry with each other. They keep it in the family. It's these weird elite bloodlines of like sociopaths that feel that they have like the right to rule, and we're just cattle. We're just tax cattle.
Have you read C. Wright Mills, The Power Elite?
No.
Oh, you would.
I need to, I guess. Yeah.
You would love it. It's all about how those elites like take over society. And I remember reading Rothbard, and he kept quoting this guy. I'm like, all right, let me read this book, and it's phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal. And he goes through how the elites maintain power. It's an older book. It was written like the 50s or the 60s. But it's if anybody out there is interested in understanding how these elites, these cabalists have taken over and maintained power. That's the book you got to go to.
What's the book again?
The Power Elite by C. Wright Mills.
Fascinating, dude. Yeah, I mean, speaking about like old, disgusting, incestuous, like reptilian families. How about that queen, man?
I know. You know, 86
And how many
years?
Americans give a shit is wild to me. Like all the fucking statists around here had their flags at half mast. I'm like, what the fuck?
Come on.
My son, yeah.
The weirdest thing about this whole thing is they're going to have to reprint all of their money, not just in England, but in Australia, to put Charles' faces on it.
What happens to that? What happens to the Queen money?
I don't know, but apparently, like I found a YouTube channel today, and she was talking about it, and just like how much money this is going to.
I should go to the bank and try to trade some in, because I bet you pretty soon that'll be like it'll be like for our grandkids, that'll be like a relic.
NFT that shit.
You know, it's funny. She gets a lot of crap in the royal family, rightfully so. But I'll tell you what, for a monarch, she wasn't. They could have done worse. And I'll give you two things that she did that I appreciate. Number one, and of course it's all ceremonial. You know, she had little power, she had little say over the issue, but she fired Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill was a psychopath. People don't realize this. Western civilization has taught people. Again, these history teachers,
an alcoholic sociopath.
He was a lunatic. Ralph Rako said he was a man who had no principles. He was guided by no principles, but rather by a love of war. That was his guiding star. It was a love of warfare, and he did more to create our current situation probably than anybody else. So she had the privilege, as the English monarch, of giving this guy his pink slip. So number one, that's pretty sick. Like the fact that she was able to fire Churchill, if I were her, I'd be like, you're welcome. But the second thing that she did was, again, is all ceremonial. She had very little say over it. But over the course of her reign, she presided over the decolonization of the English Empire to a large extent. Not always by their choice, right? Yeah. Sometimes, like in the case of India, the people would rise up and kick them out. But, it did work. And, I do give her credit for that. Just more than you could say of King George or Queen Victoria or, any of the others, who were mostly.
Yeah, I don't want to give her too much credit for that.
No.
But you're right. Absolutely. Yeah, but times were changing. Yeah, times were changing, and it wasn't popular anymore to have like imperial little kingdoms out, and out anymore. Like people were looking at that like it rightfully should be looked at as disgusting and evil.
Said, her father was a war criminal, and her father probably should have been brought up and
probably her father's father and her father before them.
Yeah, right. So specifically, what her old man did. In the first two world wars, at least the prime ministers under his reign, under his control, what they did was absolutely insane. That was war crimes. But, I don't know. I don't know. I guess they could have had worse.
They could have had worse. And I honestly, dude, I almost wonder if it was like time to take the old bird out. Cause like maybe because I don't want to give her too much credit, and because I hate the British Empire, like that passionately hate the British Empire. Yeah, and I look at the monarchs like they're just parasites. They're these people that have just been sitting there, and like I don't know if you saw that where they have like laws in order to keep the wealth inside of the royal family, so they're exempt from the 40% like the death tax, basically like the inheritance tax. Like for every other British person, if like your dad dies, the state takes 40%, and then you get to keep the other 60. But they are written into law. They're excluded because they want to keep the monarchy rich. So
you have to understand that in and of itself is an improvement, because back in the day it was like you didn't even get to ask, right? They were just like your money was their money. Right?
That's true. That's true.
In the medieval times, like what the English king and queen said was like, pay taxes. They don't pay taxes. You pay taxes to them. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? It's like they don't pay taxes; they collect them. It's like in America when a politician complains about.
Well, I mean, you were literal property of like your lord,
Yeah,
like your
exactly.
landlord,
Right,
like yeah, the
right,
feudalist system. You were their property.
right. It's
You
almost
were their
like
inheritance. Like when the lord dies, then you are his sons. Now
right.
you're his property that gets passed down.
It's
Yeah.
like living in New England today. You know?
What I was gonna
Yeah.
say is like, but you know what's wild is that like I really think this new King Charles, I think he's so much worse. That's why I think they were like taking her out because they're consolidating power right now. They're like really shifting like this new whatever you want to call this, like the Great Reset that they're trying to like implement. Like Charles is the first one that started using that language. Like before Klaus Schwab, like he's been in that shit. Like I almost think that he's actually in charge of the World Economic Forum. Like he is so all about it. He is such a fucking New World Order kind of guy.
Oh yeah.
And now that mommy's dead and he's in charge, it's almost like now I mean, I don't know, because they supposedly don't have that much power, but they kind of do, dude. Like it's this weird thing.
It's actually kind of crazy. People don't understand how much power they still have. We hear as Americans, we hear, king and queen, like constitutional monarchy, like it's outdated nowadays. Parliament, the prime minister, they have control. What they don't understand is that the king and queen in a constitutional monarchy retain a significant amount of power. Okay, so no country in the realm goes to war without the monarch's permission. Number one, and not only that, but if they want to recall a prime minister at any point, they can, right? It's all supposed to be ceremonial. You haven't had a guy do it, but once you get somebody in there to try it, you're going to find out real quick how it works, right? If Charles tomorrow said, Jacinda Ardern, come to my office, we got to talk. She has to show up. People don't understand that. That's true of a lot of countries around the world still. Like there's like 30 different, what they call them, now they don't call them an empire anymore. They call them realm countries, which is like, the politically correct term that these neoliberals will use now. But it's the same shit. But like, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. They say they retain a significant amount of power. Not only that, but also influence within the government. Mm-hmm. Like if they tell like a MP, member of parliament, I don't support this bill. Our family, we don't want this to pass. Well, that carries significant weight throughout the country. If they make a radio address, they can influence public opinion. So it's like they're not powerless at all.
Well, I also think so much like the British they really were the first ones to really they do wild shit, dude. And they're the ones that like they're groundbreaking. They like figure out these like power and control methods. And like, so one thing that I think about is like the United States was like built in opposition to the monarchy, right? Like we didn't want to have a king, but we had this type of government that like, I think was like monarchy 2.0. It was smarter because it's like, okay, if there's one king and shit's going bad, and everybody's hungry and there's inflation and shit, who do we blame? The one guy in charge, the king. We can look at the king, we can say, like, look, your head's going to roll or you're going to step down. One or the other. What do you want? But the way they do this in these like democracies is now this is like separated. So now who's in charge? Well, the Republicans in charge right now. Like Donald Trump is in charge. Well, now this shit bad happened. Okay. So then all the ire goes towards him and they're like, oh, but we can just vote him out. And then we get the Democrat. And so it's this way that they like diffuse the righteous anger and like people, you know what I'm saying? It's like, it diffuses like where we normally say like, we need that motherfucker gone. And they can just like, well, we'll just have to vote harder next time. And so that's kind of what they've done in England, where the Queen sort of like they like stepped back and they were like, well, I'm just a figurehead now. You can vote over here in Parliament, and you can fight over who's going to be like MP.
Right.
You can fight over who's going to be this and that and the other. But really, I think that bitch has a lot. Like I think they still have a hell of a lot of power, and then they don't get the blame for shit. They can be like, oh, it was Parliament. They did it.
Right. Honestly, dude, I think you're on the money. I think you're absolutely right. The way I see all this is like back in the day, like almost going back to like prehistoric times almost. You had like warring tribes, basically, of different peoples competing for like control over some geographic territory. And you know, eventually people came to the realization that rather than like, you know, tribe A versus tribe B fighting over, you know, Ruritania, let's call it. That's what Rothbard's fictional state was always. So rather than fighting over control of that land, they would say, all right, well, you know what? We'll come to a power sharing agreement. You know, every 4 years we'll have this contest and the people will decide if you rule or if I rule. And, you know, rather than fighting and killing in the fields and, you know, murdering each other, we'll do it this way. It'll be more civilized. And that's what they did. And I didn't have time to get into it in the book, but you can trace all of this back to, like, again, prehistoric times, like caveman times. There's a great book by anthropologist from Yale, James C. Scott. You guys might be familiar with. He's a pretty famous anarchist who detailed all of this in a book called Against the Grain, which is just phenomenal. But like, he goes through how like these early states formed around agricultural societies because they were able to apportion taxation based on the amount of grain that you grew. And that the societies that popped up in like coastal estuaries who weren't as dependent on grain and that weren't as easily tax apportioned remained free the longest. And here in Florida, the Calusa Indians, it wasn't until Andrew Jackson, like 150 years ago, brought them under control of some tax-paying government. So, you know, it's interesting, like the whole history behind it. And people have no idea. And I didn't have a chance to get into all that in the book. Like I started with like the Greeks and like the traditional Western society narrative. Like I didn't get into like anything pre the Greeks, but maybe one day, you know, I would like to.
Next book. Yeah.
Well, like you said before about the start of the show where you talk about like the land grabs, like, okay, we don't have land anymore, so you don't have resources. So now we're dependent on you to grow our grains.
Right.
Do you want to hear a fucking perfect example of what you're talking about? Is because like they had to, like, even at a small scale, they had to think about it again. So like back to somebody that you brought up earlier, Cecil Rhodes. I was listening to a history podcast, actually, a little bit about Cecil Rhodes and about how the way he basically conquered South Africa. So like he actually has a country that was named after him, like
Rhodesia.
What the heck is it? Rhodesia. That I can't. What is it called now?
Gone. Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe. There you go. It's Zimbabwe now. But it was named after Cecil Rhodes. He literally had his own fucking country. So he started over there. His family brought him over to Africa because that's what like rich British people would do. They would go and like send their kids to go get hard, right? They would like send them over to Africa to the colonies, right? So they would send them over there to kind of, you know, like wet their whistle and have them like get like learn control and this and that. So they put him in charge of this like cotton company because this was actually like during the Civil War. And so during the Civil War, like the cotton trade was like really fucked up because everybody was fighting with each other, right? And so like they were looking for cotton in other places. And so now it was actually profitable to be growing cottons anywhere else than the colonies, right? Than America. So they were trying to grow cotton in Africa. And so that's what he got sent down there. And his cousin was like, dude, check these diamonds out. Have you seen these? And he was like, fuck, those diamonds look awesome. So he basically like quit took his family money and went down to South Africa and started like diamond mines. And because there's a shit down there, you know, and he fucking ended up starting De Beers. Like that's all him. That's like all that fake scarcity about how diamonds aren't fucking rare at all. There's shit tons of them, but anyways, that's a different story. But so he's sitting there and he's like, fuck, man, look at all these black guys out here. Look at all these tribal people. How do I get them? It's almost like they don't want to work for almost nothing. Yeah, he goes, they grow their own food. They have their own land. They can grow their own food. They don't need this thing that I call money. They don't want it. And it's like, so I'm trying to give them like almost no money and I want them to work for me all day in my fucking diamond mine. I want to abuse them all day. And they just won't do it. So then he started like, you watch him and like the wheels are turning in his head and he's like trying to figure out a way to do this. And so he actually started doing taxes. He started like taxing them basically for just existing. And then he would little by little start appropriating and like saying, oh, well, black people can't own property anymore. So then they couldn't own the land. So he would take the land out from under them. And so then they couldn't grow their own food. And so he made them dependent on the state and made them dependent on him to feed themselves. And so then he was able to basically turn them into tax cattle and to like put them in this whole like debt-based system. And it's fucking wild. You're watching
sounds like
government from nothing. Like,
dude, it sounds like what the Federal Reserve has done, but in like fast motion.
Well,
like,
because no one wants you.
The Federal Reserve has done over the last 100 years to us.
100%, dude, because think about like your grandma or something, right? Let's say your grandma owns this property and her father built this house. Well, and on this land that you guys cultivated, this is like your family lineage land here. Grandma doesn't actually own it because if grandma gets behind on her property taxes for just existing, the house is on there, then the government can come and swoop it in. So she's absolutely forced to participate in the system to do something to earn money to pay taxes so that she can pay her property taxes. They force you into the system. Like you can never actually own something and be self-sufficient on your own. Like those African tribes, they're like, we grow our own corn, we grow our own food, we're happy in our own community. I don't want your money. Like I don't want to spend 10 hours a day in my mine. Yeah, because I want to live with my wife and my kids and like and so it's just wild, dude. And so that was just like, it was enlightening in that way. I was like, man, that's what government does to us. They force us into this like system where, it's disgusting.
And to think that a lot of those African colonies that Europe had were only the real horrors were in the future, right at that point in the Civil War era. Right, they were the Belgian Congo, the horrors of the Belgian Congo,
dude. For rubber,
all that stuff. Was in
King, what's his name, Leopold? Yeah, that motherfucker. He killed like 10 million people, dude.
This was at the same time that the British were being drawn into World War I on account of the Belgian atrocities, right? Which is ironic because the British public was being told that the Germans were committing these awful atrocities in Belgium, which were all turned out to be a lie. All without fail. These were photos staged in opera houses in Paris and other Allied controlled cities throughout Europe. They were completely made up by the Allied propagandists. Then the British cut cables running from Europe to the US from Germany so that they had a monopoly on propaganda in the US.
Yep.
And then they started feeding all these Belgian atrocities to the U.S. and U.K. public. And before you know it, the U.S. and U.K. had to join into World War I. But meanwhile, while they were making up the Belgian atrocities, Belgium actually was committing atrocities of their own in the Congo. They would cut off the arms of these poor Africans. I mean, if you didn't meet your daily quota, you would be like have limbs amputated. Yeah, I mean, it's just really horrible, horrible stuff.
They figured dumb things out. They're like, well, we can't cut off a leg because then they won't be able to work as much, but we don't want to be able to really run either. So let's just cut off like some of their foot. So then they'll still be able to work, but they won't be able to run and they won't be like, they were just sick and fucked up and evil, dude. Like that King Leopold was such a piece of shit.
And the worst of all atrocities, by the way, that occurred in World War I was what the British themselves were doing to Germany. Right, the British hunger blockade of Germany in World War I was one of the most awful events. People, again, you'll never hear this in public school, not in a Western public school, not in an Anglo-American public school, that's for sure. But after the war was over, the British had surrendered, the Germans had surrendered, but the British maintained a blockade, which was throughout the whole course of the war, it was on food and medicine, which was a violation of international law. It's a violation of the rules of warfare, even to this day. When you impose a blockade on a people, you don't blockade the civilian population from food and medicine. But this is what the British did. The Germans surrendered. They maintained this blockade for over a year after the surrender in order to get them to sign this lopsided Treaty of Versailles.
Yep.
It was the only way to get the Germans to sign this treaty. And once the German minister signed it, Matthias Erzberger, he signed the Treaty of Versailles, went back to Germany, and was immediately assassinated by German nationalists, who, of course, in the long run, this would give birth to Hitler, and not only Hitler, but it would give birth to Italian fascism and Mussolini. It would, again, I go through this in the book. The Treaty of Versailles had such, widespread effects throughout the war, from Vietnam to China to Russia to like everything that we're dealing with today can basically be traced back to World War I.
Yeah.
So,
yep.
And you talk about not learning history in school. I think one of the problems is that we learn it in a way where I'm going to look for my military fight in your military, but the reality is that your military is going to attack directly. Like, it's going to attack people directly. It's going to starve them. It's going to destroy medicines. It's going to cut them off from needed resources. And that's what, I don't think people get before the war. Like, it's just like
they're taught not to get that, though.
Yeah, exactly.
They're indoctrinated into believing soldier versus soldier. It's going to be an honorable war. They've never had an honorable war. There's never been such thing as an honorable war.
No, because when you talk about it's illegal, it's like it doesn't mean shit. Like,
dude, the 100,000 Japanese.
And World War I was such an interesting time too, because that was like right around the what the fuck do they call that? Oh gosh darn it, what do you call that? The revolution where everybody started getting industrial revolution. The industrial revolution is what I meant. And so like they started mass producing all these crazy shit, and they had all these like crazy weapons that they had never had before.
Right.
And so it was like an interesting time where they were just like, they didn't even know what they were doing. And they were just like, it was all theoretical, and they were all like, well, I think we can. That's when they started like, from like a whole war might have like 500 casualties in a day, and it turned into like 20,000 in a fucking hour, and people were like, holy shit, we had never seen murder on this fucking scale before.
You are absolutely right. That's one of the things that I mentioned in the book, is that like they're using the old school strategies of warfare, where you just, you have a line of guys marching to a line of guys, but now they're doing it with modern weapons.
Yeah,
right.
Fucking just mowing people down.
The battles, the casualty counts in these battles was unreal. The Battle of Somme was, I think it was the deadliest battle in human history. This is just a battle, right? This is not even a war. This is a battle. Over 1 million casualties in just a battle. Passchendaele, the Marne, Verdun, they all had similar numbers. Hundreds of thousands we're talking about. Each one of these battles, 700, 800,000, 600,000 men died for politicians, for J.P. Morgan and John fucking Rockefeller. That's why hundreds of thousands of people died.
You also, if you trace that shit back, you can see where like the Russian Revolution never would have come to pass if these fucking American bankers hadn't given them all that fucking money. The Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Morgans,
they were bankrolling the whole thing.
Funded them, yeah. They were
bankrolling the whole thing.
Like $8 million and sent him on his way back to Russia.
Morgan had lent, I forget the exact amount. He lent a shit ton of money to England, France, and Russia. So, in order for him to make his money back, he needed a decisive victory. He needed the U.S. to enter the war. The American public was dead set against not getting involved. Thank God we had these oceans to separate us from this nonsense in Europe. Thank God we weren't part of this European civil war, is what it was. And Woodrow Wilson campaigned the war broke out halfway through his first term, and his re-election campaign, his motto, the theme of his campaign was, he kept us out of the war. That's how he got reelected. Less than 6 months after winning re-election, it was all a lie. The whole time he was planning on getting us involved in the war. And again, I go through all in the book about how he provoked the Lusitania in Germany into firing on the Lusitania and how he dragged the American people kicking and screaming into that war. And thank God we were only in it for a year and a half, but we still had time to lose over 100,000 people.
And it reverberates. Like, okay, so World War I was trench warfare. So, like, it's pretty disgusting being in a trench. Like, you, me, 1,000 other men just shitting, pissing, eating all in this trench. Now, if you look at all the World War II propaganda from Germany, they were talking about, like, diseased people and germs. They were using all these metaphors. Now, do you think people who had, like, this trench war experience where obviously, like, germs would kill people, you'd be so fucking traumatized by that?
And you're absolutely right. And the fucked up thing about all of it is that trench warfare starts under Lincoln, right? The first instance of trench warfare that we see is in Northern Virginia, in the Tidewater region, where Robert E. Lee and the Southerners, the Americans, are trying to fend off Grant and the invading force, and also against Sherman in Atlanta. The Southerners dug in trenches to protect them from the shells. They were dropping shells right into the city. They could care less if it hit a civilian's home. It could hit an orphanage full of kids. They could care less. Sherman said, "I have to make what did he say? I have to make the old and young, rich and poor alike feel the hard hand of war." And all that trench warfare started in Civil War. And by the way, at the same time that Lincoln is massacring civilians in America, Otto von Bismarck is doing the same thing in Germany. So the American people are becoming accustomed to all this horror, all this bloodshed, to trench warfare, like you're saying, Tone. While at the same time, the Europeans are becoming accustomed to all this horror and this bloodshed and this trench warfare in Germany, because Lincoln's uniting the American states, I say. I think Tom DiLorenzo was the one who said Lincoln made a desert and called it peace, right? That's what he did. And Bismarck was doing the same shit in Europe. But without these two events happening, the people never would have tolerated World War I and World War II. And World War I was so unpopular. Look, it created the Russian Revolution, right? Lenin was a product of the unpopularity of the First World War. And I don't know if you guys read Farewell to Arms by Hemingway, but like he captures this one scene where I talk about it in the book at the Battle of Caporetto. The entire Italian army is deserting. The whole army is like, we don't want to fight. Like the one guy says to this other guy, he's like, "What brigade are you guys in?" And he's like, the Peace Brigade. He's like, "We're done fighting." And then you have the Christmas Eve truce of 1914.
Dude, I love that one. Yeah, that's absolutely beautiful. Dude.
British and German troops go out into no man's land, which was like, you have to understand what no man's land was.
And they were in trenches at that time too. It was like this
That's what
ugly,
I mean.
Muddy, shitty, yeah.
And like no man's land was like, nobody ventured out to no man's land. It's like, this is where people go to die. But they heard Silent Night playing, and they started playing, and then they heard him playing in response. Then they came out, they were playing soccer, they were having drinks, they were celebrating Christmas Eve. When the elites, when the politicians heard about this, they went bonkers, they went nuts, they couldn't believe it. They ordered both sides back to their trenches where they had to go fire upon the men with whom they had just broken bread for Christmas. It's insane what people will do for politicians. It really is.
That could have been the end of World War One.
Right there,
it should have been. Yeah,
it never should have happened.
I have to ask you a really dumb question, Sal. So I don't think this
Please.
is true, but someone once told me, and I've never been able to confirm this, the Ferris wheel was invented during the Civil War. And I just want to know whether you've ever heard of this.
I've never heard of that.
As the way that people would go on it and shoot people. So basically you're on a Ferris wheel, and as you go up towards the top, you'd shoot, then you'd load your rifle, you go back down, and it just basically becomes like a...
Dude,
really...
let me tell you something. I would not be surprised, because they really came up with some crazy stuff during this era. There was one battle where they couldn't get to the Southerners. They were entrenched. And I forget if it was like Chickamauga or Chancellorsville or wherever it was, but they actually like tunneled underneath like where they were. and then they tried to like blow them up from under the ground. And like the Southerners were like, they were saying like all of a sudden like there was this big boom. Like I wasn't in my tent at the time, but thank God, all of a sudden the ground just collapsed, and like there's all kinds of horrible stuff. But you know, they really did try to come up with like innovative ways to murder people around this era,
dude. And it wouldn't surprise me too, because like so much of the things that like we have, like weird little technologies, you find out later that like these were like you said, Tony, something like the Ferris wheel that like you take like your girlfriend on to go and smooch her when you're up top and stuff. Like so much of those like things were invented to kill people. Like it's like so much of these things, like it's the military industrial complex that has like a swell of money that they took from you, and they're just like trying to come up with ways to murder each other. And they're like, well, maybe it doesn't work for that. We'll give it to the citizens and they can do something stupid with it. Well, like so many technologies are
all of NASA, the entire space shuttle program, right? All of that is a product of World War II, Operation Paperclip. Werner von Braun, who had come up with the rocket, and Hitler used it to send V2s into London. And then when we rolled in with American tanks, we took Werner von Braun, sent them back to America. We're like, all right, you can die or you can come work for us. So they all came back and worked for us, where we sent them to the moon and stuff like that. And you know, eventually, I know. And then, eventually you get Elon Musk, and, the rest is history.
Yeah. It's funny, man. And all I was going to say a little bit earlier was just what set up how World War I could even be possible too, is someone was giving me a little bit of more historical context that it was like, what set that shit up really was that, okay, so let's say like in the 1700s, things like that, like the Europeans would just like fight. They would just fight because it was like for sport. Right. So it was almost like I've got my team and you've got your team. It was like a football game. Right. And like I had like 2,000 troops and you had 2,000 troops. And then we'd have them go shoot at each other for a little bit and have this little skirmish. And then like maybe 5 people would die. And then we'd come back. And that's like how wars were. And it was kind of like strutting and like, oh, I won this one. Well, I won this one because like all these monarchs were fucking related. You know what I mean? All these guys, they were all fucking weird inbred cousins and shit like that. And so they're like, they kind of would fight over a border maybe, but it was all just like for pride and bluster and things like that. But then after the French Revolution, you have one of the Napoleons, right? Napoleon Bonaparte, like started like really doing some shit. And like he started like the mass murder where he would just start getting like every single boy that could hold a weapon. Like he started like the death toll where he was like, because there's a quote from him. He's like, I run through 30,000 people a week or something like that. Because he says I can expend like 30,000 a week because he started war on a different scale and then what it did is it made the stakes different. You know what I mean? War wasn't just about like a football match where we were all proper and we'd stand in line. We had these like beautiful, immaculate outfits with all the little horns on our head and all the like the little dumb shit and they'd shoot each other. Like he turned it into a motherfucking different thing. And then around that technological age where they started getting these crazy weapons, like all these people were like used to that kind of fucking war. And then they had all these new toys and then it really fucking like it. Yeah. That was another building block.
It's interesting because in a way the monarchs was almost an improvement, right? From like the democracy of Greece where you have like the city-states would just be, massacring each other, and like the Roman Republic would like, them in Carthage, and the wars would just be just terrible and barbaric and just bloody and just ruthless. And then eventually, like you're saying, you would have these monarchs where they're all interbred and interrelated. And it was almost like, you're not going to go to war with your cousin Bob, are you? You know what I mean? So it's like, eventually, like, for the medieval times, like there was wars, there was conflict, but it was a little bit headed off a little bit to a certain extent. And that was even the case up until World War I, where you had, Tsar Nicholas II and Kaiser Wilhelm were cousins.
They were cousins, and their grandmother was the queen at the time in England, and stuff like that.
Right.
Like, yeah,
and Wilhelm said to Nicholas, like, "Come on, man, cousin Nicky, you know what I mean? Come on, are we really going to go to war with one another right now?" And the Russian military at the time was like, we have to mobilize. The Germans are mobilizing, and the German military was like, Wilhelm, we have to mobilize. The Russians are mobilizing. And it was almost like one hand washes the other kind of thing. But it's like that interbred sort of that monarchy, that system of monarchy was almost keeping Europe afloat. But the problem was it was too unstable. It was way too unstable of a system to like maintain society's affairs this way. It was bound to implode at some point.
Yeah, well, and that was the difference too, right? With Napoleon, he was blue. He wasn't blue blood. He was a commoner that made his way up there, and then he was declaring himself emperor, and so he was never considered an equal amongst all of them. And so, like, I think, and he was also, well, I mean, he was a fucking psychopath, and he wanted to take over the fucking world. So, I mean, he was also a piece of shit, but he was also looked at like the anti-monarchy. And in this weird way, and that was like the first step in this, like, and that's sort of what a lot of people say World War I was about trying to take down the monarchies and trying to put republics and democracies in their place. And that's maybe what the bankers wanted, because they could actually have more power and control. And
all the history, how it just comes together is so interesting. In the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, when the Germans beat the French, right? They had this illustrious ceremony in the Palace of Versailles, right, where they crowned Wilhelm the Emperor. And it was just like the French were just completely humiliated. They not only had they lost, but now one of their main palaces was the location for Wilhelm to be crowned the new emperor of their territory, nonetheless, right? It's a very humiliating affair. So that's why at the end of World War I, where did they hold the treaty? That the French now the French were victorious. Where did they hold their treaty with Germany? Palace of Versailles. And it was sort of like a spit in your eye, kind of kick you while you're down kind of thing on the French's part. And that's why the Treaty of Versailles was so lopsided. It was so unfair. It was so unstable of a treaty. Germany was forced to sign. They were forced to agree to an unspecified amount of reparations, basically just saying like, "Hey, start sending money. We'll let you know when you're done paying." And they lost, all their colonies abroad, all their territories. 30% of their territory, their pre-war territory, was lost at Versailles. So, obviously the situation was ripe. And not only that, but then they had hyperinflation as a result of trying to pay for the war. We all know about what Mises said about Weimar Germany. We've all seen pictures of wheelbarrows full of money that Germans had in Weimar Germany. Kids using stacks of money as blocks to play with. Germans would heat their home, with this money. They were going broke trying to pay these war reparations. Then when they couldn't pay it, France said, okay, then we're going to reinvade. So the French reinvaded in 1923. They reoccupied France. So, the Germans were just completely humiliated through the 1920s. And as a result of this, communism spread throughout Germany.
Yeah.
And as a result to the communism, the nationalism arose. And they were like, we're going to stop the communists. And who was the head of the Nationalist Party? Well, the number 2 of the Nationalist Party was Hitler.
Yep.
And when the number 1 guy died, Paul von Hindenburg, when Hindenburg died, Hitler was left in control. And just like that, he seized complete control. And, then before you know it, Hitler, the nationalists, their goal was not initially, we're going to murder all the Jews. It was, we're going to take back all that territory that we lost at Versailles. We're going to get it back. All that humiliation we suffered, we're going to get back. All that territory, Gdansk, Alsace-Lorraine, all the territory we lost to the Poles and to the French, we're going to get it back. And that's what he did. He took it back. The problem was he didn't stop there. He just kept going.
Yeah. So, and the world would have let him keep it too. Like they were kind of divided on Poland, but they were kind of like some of those, but when he took back a big chunk of that land, man, I can't even remember what that was called, but he took back that little land and they were like, well, they're all German speaking anyways. And that used to be their kind of land. So they let him have it. And if he would have exactly.
Yeah, but by the time you get a whole war industry, you can't stop that shit. It's
you can't stop it.
Exactly.
Just like, You got to just
but Tone, when we say the war industry, we're really talking about the elites. That's what I learned about writing this whole book. When we say the war industry, we're really talking about the Morgans, the Rockefellers. Nowadays,
these crazy companies, dude, like IBM. IBM was like International Business Machine was involved. They helped them automate the Holocaust. If it hadn't been for IBM, they would never have been able to do it and organize it in a way to like sit there and mass murder the Jews.
And now they get government contracts.
These companies are still here. Mercedes, all these fucking places, they were all, it's just absolutely wild. And
they get taxpayer funded contracts.
Yeah, man.
And then, and then I took a deep dive into like the Pacific aspect of World War II, because that's where you want to talk about horseshit. I mean, first of all, Roosevelt completely instigated. The Germans learned their lesson. They weren't going to fire the first shot like they did in World War I. They just would not be provoked. Roosevelt knew this, so he turned his ire on the Japanese. And the Japanese were eventually forced into firing the first shot at Pearl Harbor, just as Lincoln had forced the South into firing the first shot at Sumter. So that kicked off the war in the Pacific. But what people don't understand is how horrific this fighting was on these islands, and these little islands in the Pacific that people have never heard of. Cape Gloucester, Iwo Jima, Peleliu. People never heard of these islands.
Philippines, all of these little, dude, was
brutal.
Fucked.
Hand-to-hand jungle combat was just awful stuff. Just brutal stuff. All of this paved the way for Vietnam, right?
Yeah.
All of this paved the way for the jungle warfare in the 60s and the 70s. So it's
dude, in World War II in the Middle East, the way that England divided things up set it up for what we did in Iraq.
1,000%. And I have a whole chapter about how we wound up in the Middle East.
I blame the British Empire for all of it. Like, I can go back, I can be like that crazy guy with all the red strings, you know what I mean, on the fucking board.
Though.
Yeah, you can trace back the British Empire for almost every modern problem.
The British promised the same little spit of land to the Jews, to the Zionists,
to the Jews, to the Palestinians, to the French, to the Russians. Exactly. They promised all of them just to try to keep them in the war. Yeah.
And there's this great, if anybody's ever seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, it's
that's fucked, man.
There's another.
Lawrence didn't want to do that. If you historically look at it, he knew he was betraying all the Arabs, because he became one of them almost. And they they had a different type of system, dude, where they literally your word meant something, because they and so they believed Lawrence when he said, because he was kind of like the ambassador. And he was working with them, and he was saying if you turn against your Ottoman rulers, if you fight for us and you get, if you're anyways, we promise you this, land. And they were fucking liars.
Not only that,
the British are fucking liars.
Not only that, but as a result of U.S. nuclear capabilities, right? And which is a whole other story that I cover. It's just horrendous the way Harry Truman deployed a nuclear bomb on not one, but on 2 civilian populations. And I go through in the whole book how he did not do it for wartime necessity, as he tried to convince the public, but rather for diplomatic purposes. He did it so that he would have the upper hand with the Soviets in post-war negotiations. And that diplomatic imbalance created the Cold War, which, in other words, Roosevelt's relationship with the Soviets was based on skepticism. All right, we got to work with you. All right, I got to trust you. You got to trust me. We have a common enemy. We'll deal with each other. Truman knew, well, you know what? I don't need you sons of bitches anymore. I got this secret weapon now. I got the nuclear bomb. You guys can go screw. I don't need you anymore. So because of that, he was able to take a more hardline approach with the Soviets. That was what created the Cold War. And that, because of the Cold War, eventually in the 1980s, the Soviets wound up in Afghanistan because they thought that this would be a good, if we can, control Central Asia, not only will this be a good buffer against U.S. interference or U.S. intervention into the Soviet mainland, but maybe one day we can even extend our way down to Pakistan, where we could have a warm water port for the first time. Russians have never had a warm water port. They've always wanted one. Even to this day, that's what's going on in the Ukraine right now, right? They need a warm water port. That's another story. But at the time, this had forced the Soviets into Central Asia. And as a result of the World War II nuclear capabilities, the imbalance that created, that led to eventually, long-term, 1980s, it led to the Soviets in Afghanistan, which eventually, before you know it, if you guys have ever seen the movie Charlie Wilson's War, the U.S. began covertly trickling weapons into Afghanistan to certain mujahideen. One of these mujahideen happened to be some guy by the name of Osama bin Laden.
Never heard of him.
Right? And who would come to know it after eventually we wound up in the Gulf War fighting for Rockefeller oil again in 1991. This is after we did it in Japan in 1942, fighting for Rockefeller oil. We're doing it again in 1991, beating Saddam Hussein back for eventually what became known as Saudi Aramco, which is like the Saudi national oil company, which was Rockefeller tied to the Rockefellers, who were linked to George Bush 1. So we wound up in the Middle East by the British promising shit to the people they shouldn't have, by the Soviets. We're fighting the Soviets, and we wound up in the Saudi Peninsula because of Rockefeller oil. So all these different reasons conglomerate into the U.S. presence on the Saudi Peninsula. Bin Laden doesn't like it, and he starts this campaign against U.S. interests, which eventually escalates into 9/11. Well, guess what? The American elites, the American politicians couldn't be happier, right? Because now, when you're fighting Germans or Japs, it's like, you're fighting Germans or Japs, but anybody can be a terrorist, right? When your enemy is an ideology, when it's an idea, anybody can be the enemy. So guess what? We're all suspects. That's why everybody's got to be searched at the airport. Everybody's telephone has to be tapped now. It just gives them an excuse to do whatever they want, carte blanche. And that includes murdering civilians, like we were talking about earlier, Anwar al-Awlaki or his kids. And it includes locking up journalists like Julian Assange, or exiling people who reveal shit like Edward Snowden, or prosecuting Chelsea Manning, or any of these people. It's just, one thing leads to another. And, now we live in this pseudo-fascist, corporatist police state where, people get locked up for, by the way, all that military equipment, eventually, like, the war becomes unpopular and we switch to drone warfare. And eventually all that surplus military equipment, now that we're using drones, where does it go? It
ends up on our streets, man. Yeah, all these police departments, these little tiny towns of ours that have 10,000 people in it. Why do they have a fucking tank and a SWAT team?
Who's it going to be used on?
Who needs a fucking tank?
Domestic terrorist.
Bin Laden's not in small town America. You are. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Come on, we are. So
it's Al Qaeda now. Yeah.
Bob Higgs.
That's what it is, man.
He goes, all wars eventually come home. And I think clearly that's what's happened with the war on terror, obviously. I mean, there was a video not too long ago in Florida of some guy getting pulled over in a Bearcat. He got pulled over by a guy in a tank. I mean, come on.
It's Ron Paul saying, right? It's like terrorism is the price of empire.
Yeah. Right. It's and another good quote he had that I quote him in the book is he says that it's no coincidence that the century of warfare coincided with the century of central banking.
Yep.
Because without these Kabbalists funding this nonsense, it never would have been possible.
Yeah,
And
100%,
not only
dude.
that,
Without
but then
fractional reserve banking, without getting off of the gold standard and having like money that actually meant something, we'd never been able to pretend that we went to the moon, and we'd never also be able to like build these crazy, like nuclear weapons programs and all this crazy shit.
They bankroll these wars, and it creates this the boom bust business cycle that Mises talks about and all this stuff. And eventually it comes back to bite in the ass in the form of a recession. Well, that recession is then used as another emergency, another crisis.
So
again,
let's print more money and send everybody checks.
With TARP and bailout for bankers and, airlines and everybody else.
Yeah.
It's a big scam.
Yeah, but during that recession, we get to buy up all the assets. So we have to have the recession. That's
it's a scam, and guess what? We're on the wrong end of the stick.
It's a great scam. It's a pattern to it for sure.
But it almost seems like they're getting to the end of the rope at this time, because you see them all, dude. They're like cashing out, and there's like major members of government that are like stepping down, and like it just like. They know that like the game is up at this point. Like I think that like you're watching it crumble, and they're going to be. I'm actually talking to somebody pretty soon. We're going to be talking about CBDCs and things like that, about these central bank digital currencies and how they're they're going to get off the dollar at some point because they destroyed the system.
The CBDCs are the worst because
it's the worst.
That's going to help them target. So right now the problem they have with all these stimulus injections is like they have to keep this Ponzi scheme going. So they have to eventually, like every now and then, they have to like do fresh injections of capital to keep. It's almost like a junkie, rather than going through withdrawals, has to take a shot of dope in the arm, right? So it's like every now and then they have to take a shot of dope. Well, every now and then the Federal Reserve has to inject the economy with a shot of capital, and they can't have you spending that capital on hard assets like gold or real estate or guns or something like that. They need you to go out and consume. Go to Applebee's, go to the bar, buy, go to the movies, consume. Keep all these, like, keep the whole Ponzi scheme, like keep these employees alive, keep that service sector economy going. And if they have the CBDCs, then you can get a little notification on your phone, and they can say, congratulations, we've just given you $5,000, but it can only be spent at Target or the movies. It can't be spent at the gun shop. Can't be spent at the Coinbase. It can't be spent at the buying gold or anything like that. And
I think that's one step towards that too. It's like, so the government can't technically the government can't tell you can't buy guns, right? Unless you're a felon, and then they can take those rights away from you. That's one I love to give to conservatives. It's like, so our rights are God-given, right? Oh, right. So felons should be able to have guns too, right? Because that's a right to self-defense, and then they lose their mind. But anyway,
God took their rights,
Yeah. Well, yeah. They lose it. But so that's the other thing. So, God damn it, what was I going to say? Okay, so that's how the government uses companies like Visa and MasterCard and this and that and the other, because they're attacking gun companies even more. So they're just denying transactions. So I can try to go in and use my debit card to go and buy a fucking gun. And I'm hearing about big major companies going no, we're not going to do that transaction because there's gun control. I mean, we need gun control.
Look what they did in Canada with the truckers.
100%.
They were seizing bank accounts for people just who were protesting.
Yep. A lady gave $10 or something, and then they're like, well, we're freezing your bank account. But I'm not going to be able to pay my mortgage. I'm going to go into foreclosure.
They don't care.
Sorry, bitch.
They don't give a shit about you or me or your mortgage or if you can afford to feed your family.
Yeah, because they own banks too, so they're like, okay, well, we'll take your house too. That's all right.
they just don't. This is what people don't understand. It's like they don't give a shit about you. It's like the quicker people understand that, the better off we're all going to be. Dispense with that fiction, people. They don't care about you, not even a little bit. Right? If Nancy Pelosi's portfolio can go up by 10% to sacrifice, everybody who you know and love, guess what? See ya. It's gone. Yeah. That's it.
so she can afford more eyebrow injections and $20 ice cream pops. And
It's insane. Crazy.
all right, brother. We've had you on for quite a while. I think it's late where you're at.
I have been
man.
rambling. I apologize.
Oh, I love it, dude. No, this is what we do on here.
You got me going.
Yeah, it's good.
I blame
this
you
is
guys.
what we do. Brother, what's the name of your new book that's coming out?
I'm going to call it The American Experiments, and the subtitle is probably going to be something along the lines of like what your public school history teacher won't tell you or something like that.
Hell yeah.
It should be out another month or so, I'm hoping. So maybe like beginning of November. Yeah. Yeah.
Dude, I definitely want to read it. And when it's out, we'll buy a couple copies and we'll do another giveaway to our audience.
Absolutely. So, let's do it.
Fuck yeah. Well, dude, I appreciate you. This was a hell of a lot of fun. Sal, do you have any other plugs you want to do? Like 3D printers go burr? I mean, we're almost getting to the end of that, right?
3D printers
How is that going to affect you?
What's that?
The new, like, where didn't dipshit say there's going to be some ghost gun ban-y thing? Like, we talked about that a little bit. Has any of that even come into?
He can go fuck himself.
Yeah,
I mean, this is black market anarchism.
Yeah,
he can go
100%. But like, isn't he like making it illegal to sell like partials and stuff? Like, and
maybe
I have no idea.
I'm still selling them for crypto.
Good.
I still got peer-to-peer cash. If you want to buy them and you want to purchase one without having to access a KYC payment platform, so there's no record of it, the government can, so Visa or MasterCard can't prevent that sale, I'm your guy, 3dprintedgoburr.com. Other than that, agorithreads.com for libertarian anarchist apparel. My current book out is Anti-Politics, which we've spoken about before. The new one should be out in a month or so. It's called The American Experiment. Check that out too. And that's about it, man.
Hell yeah, dude. And Tony, I'm excited to fucking read your little book. And when we're done here, I'll send you the Sasquatch documentary so you can check that out. It's a quick, awesome one. It's like 30 minutes long and it's fucking legit.
Hell yeah. Please do.
And what's that called again too?
The Search for Psychic Sasquatch. It's a fun one, man.
I got that.
And I got to bring my 15-year-old son with me, which was a lot of fun. Nice. I took him out in the woods and we went hunting for Bigfoot.
Awesome.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I'm going to hit the outro.
Have a good night, guys.